Hi, this is Steve Matteo at WUSB 90.1 in Stony Brook, and I'm here with Trevor Christian. And today our guest is Shawn Otto. He is the author of The War on Science: Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It, which was published in 2016. And he also wrote the novel Sins of Our Fathers. He co-founded and became the CEO of the Science Debate 2008 with presidential candidates Barack Obama and John McCain. He delivered the keynote addresses at the 45th Annual Nobel Conference on Democracy in the Age of Science at the United States National Academies, on examining the mistrust of science, the New York Academy of Sciences, the Euroscience Open Forum, and the European Conference of Science Journalists. He has discussed science and politics on National Public Radio's Talk of the Nation Science Friday. He's been published in Science, Salon, Huffington Post, and Scientific American. And he co-authored the screenplay for and co-produced the 2003 film The House of Sand and Fog, starring Ben Kingsley. Shawn, thanks very much for being here. We really appreciate it.
No, I'm happy to be here.
And mostly what we want to talk about today, and again, this is not television, but we're going to want to talk about this book, The War on Science. And it's interesting, it came out in 2016. That year seems to be, it's going to be a year that I think in American history we're unfortunately never going to forget or would like to forget. So, I mean, just to get started here, obviously the book came out in 2016, but what was the impetus to write it and how long did it take for you to write it?
The impetus was just what we ran into when we tried to set up the science debate. Science debate was an initiative that was started by me and Matthew Chapman, who were both known in Hollywood as screenwriters who could write about science. Matthew happened to be Charles Darwin's great great grandson. And he and I were both competing to write a movie about Albert Einstein. The Hollywood writers' strike happened in 2007, and that project fell apart. But Matthew and I started talking to each other about how none of the candidates for president were talking about any of these big science and tech issues that were really starting to dominate all the public conversation and change all of our public policy in every way. And we thought, we've got some time on our hands. Let's try to put together a science debate. Let's reach out to the national academies and the American Association for the Advancement of Science and get these candidates online and talking about this. And what we found when we did that was two things. One was there was a huge outpouring of interest from the entire US science enterprise. We had uh, dozens and dozens of Nobel laureates sign on to a public letter about this. We had tech company CEOs and members of Congress and bench scientists. We wound up with tens of thousands of supporters. So we knew that there was a hunger, that a lot of people in the public felt this way. But at the same time, the candidates themselves were really, really reluctant to talk about this. In fact, we wound up having a science debate set up at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, and it was going to be broadcast nationally on NPR and on PBS. I'm sorry. David Brancaccio was going to moderate, and at the last minute, the candidates who had been hemming and hawing about this wound up backing out. And what they did instead, what Obama and Clinton did instead, anyway, at that time, was to debate faith and values at the Compassion Forum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And that struck me as just kind of a stunning change in America's public dialogue, where science, which had been as American as apple pie and mom and the flag, was suddenly something politicians were avoiding, while religion, something that you always hear politicians don't want to talk about because it's divisive, they were stumbling over themselves to debate. So something had flipped upside down in America. And that really became the impetus to exploring that and figuring out what happened.
I see. And you said Obama and Clinton, you meant Obama and McCain, I believe. Is that what you meant?
No, I meant Obama and Clinton. Obama and McCain and Clinton and Huckabee were all invited to this science debate.
Oh,
Huckabee dropped out. McCain backed out.
Hillary Clinton.
And then, yes,
All right, I'm
Hillary
sorry.
Clinton and Obama, because it was not a nonpartisan issue. So we were presenting it as a nonpartisan approach. So then Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were going back and forth with us still, since they were engaged in a pretty tightly fought primary battle at the time. And we were talking to both camps, but then they both backed out on the same day. And we later found out why they backed out, because they decided to do this compassion forum instead.
I see. So you have a
And I should say, that wasn't what you would suspect from Democratic presidential candidates, because people even then perceived the Democratic Party as kind of more pro-science, because since the days of George W. Bush, who had really kind of gone in an anti-science direction in his presidency. So that was particularly striking as well.
Yes, I can remember George W. Bush when he was debating Al Gore. He called Al Gore Ozone Man,
Yeah.
which is just unbelievable. So you have a chapter in the book, The Rise of the Anti-Science News Media, and I think that's a lot of what we'd like to talk about today. And you do a really good job of sort of laying out not just the rise of sort of anti-science media, but kind of how we got even where we are today in terms of starting out with when Reagan was able to eliminate the fairness doctrine, and then you go through the sort of changes in the media in terms of AM right-wing talk radio, cable news rising, a lot of these different things. I think one of the obvious questions that I would want to ask, and I think it kind of ties into the whole subject, is so much of really what this is in terms of anti-science, the war on science, and particularly as we talk about it in the media, is simply the fossil fuel industry does not want the truth to be out there about climate change. And they do, and particularly the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry, really is not happy about the idea that other forms of media, I'm sorry, other forms of energy will be more pervasive in the country and take over. So we have, less reliance on fossil fuels, which pollute the environment and cause one of the reasons that we have global warming. So is a lot of what this is really driven by the fossil fuel industry?
A lot of it, yeah, that's how it started, at least. And some of it is still driven by the fossil fuel industry, um, but it's really metastasized into our political culture at this point. But the fossil fuel industry made a multi-billion-dollar investment, especially from about 2008 to 2010. You might remember in Obama's first address to Congress, State of the Nation, he um, he asked Congress to do two things. And this was a Democratic controlled Congress. And he asked them to pass a National Health Care Act, and he asked them to send him a bill that would uh, help begin to solve climate change, and by regulating it with a carbon tax, cap and trade system. And at that point, that's really served as kind of an alarm for the fossil fuel industry, who had been promoting disinformation and sowing doubt and uncertainties about the science through the different research arms of the American Petroleum Institute and through private groups funded by the Koch brothers and other PR firms that were hired by ExxonMobil, et cetera. But after that speech, they really kicked into overdrive, and they spent billions and billions of dollars funding the Tea Party and creating a network of disinformation that utilize the burgeoning internet and social media in ways that we haven't seen before. And this network of people wound up really, they realized that they didn't have to convince the entire American public. They just had to convince a small group of people that surrounded Republican lawmakers so that they could create the impression that those lawmakers were in danger if they supported any kind of cap and trade system. So this network of people that they created then, the influencers, donors, and party activists that were in that network of people surrounding Republican lawmakers, wound up then becoming so successful at this that they essentially were able to instill fear in the democratically controlled Senate uh, and cause the failure of that cap and trade bill. And after that happened, that large investment that was made in all this infrastructure through PR firms and through these grassroots astroturf organizations that were created, and this large social media outreach effort, they saw how effective they'd been, and they looked around for other clients that they could apply the same anti-regulatory model to. And it turns out that there are a lot of businesses out there who have business models where they have products that are not necessarily good for the environment or for public health, uh, sort of like smoking, or like the oil industry, or like lead paint, or like pesticides, or like sugar, that still can benefit from a lot of profit if they are kept going. So those were their targets, is businesses, large corporations that engaged in this kind of commodity businesses. And they began to spread out and do these same kind of campaigns targeting the same kind of people. So those people, those Republican activists, donors, likely donors, began being targeted by disinformation over and over and over again by this group. And that really was the beginning of what we saw as kind of the nascent Trump coalition, the people who really engaged in conspiracy theories and began to move away from any kind of trust in mainstream media and really to disregard our public perception of truth in favor of these alternative facts, as the Trump people call them.
You're talking about a lot of how the alternative facts came from the top. Can you speak at all to the way that alternative facts came from the bottom, the conspiracy theorists on the internet, and how those forces eventually met and formed some kind of alliance?
Yeah, sure. Well, that was originally part of the beauty of the internet, is that people that have interests that in common, but that are geographically separated, could still find each other. But of course, that has its dark side, because people who have divergent views from reality can also find each other and then support each other and reinforce each other with a sort of perversion of peer review, where you hear, "Oh yeah, that is true. I agree with you. I support you in that," and you get that kind of social reinforcement. Where there's no real check, there's no real factual test that you're applying to anything, but you begin to build up an alternative reality with people. And those kinds of, it's very similar to cult psychology, but it happens online instead of in a physically proximate group. And those online cults then wind up reinforcing each other, and they were easy prey for this kind of public information manipulation.
At this time, what, say, I'll use the word organizations or anybody or institutions or anybody in the media, journalists, they could be print, whatever the case may be, um, exposing what you're talking about and or trying to um, create a backlash to it or counter it, so to speak, at this particular time. And I'm not
Well, I
talking
think
about like Greenpeace because I think we know where they stand. They're probably the most high profile, um, environmental organization in the world, I would guess, unless you would care to counter that.
no, they definitely are the most high profile organization, environmental organization. Um, there are a lot of mainstream news media outlets and public intellectuals, thinkers, professors, scientists who have begun to write about this and trace how this has happened, do science on it, understand, really develop more knowledge on how we can be moved to diverge in views by disinformation. Um, and have begun working to expose that, but I think that we're all behind the eight ball on it. The technology has leapfrogged ahead of our ability to handle it. And if you look back in history, this isn't unusual. This isn't something that hasn't happened before. Generally speaking, when we've had a new communication technology emerge, it's been incredibly disruptive socially. After the printing press came out, uh, Luther, nailed those uh, his doctrine on the church door.
Theses.
Thank you, his thesis. Thank you, and said, don't take my word for it. Read it for yourself. You can read the Bible yourself now, and this broad approach or availability of that information through the printing press and the ability of people to publish their own opinions in newsletters in print really was something that people weren't prepared for. Taking that information in from a non-authority figure meant that anything that they read anywhere was taken with authority, and that disruption led to the whole Reformation and the violence that happened with that. A similar thing happened in the 1920s and 30s with the rise of radio and film strips and the phonograph, which the Nazis adopted to use broad inculcation, spreading the Nazi message politically. It's almost always political actors that first adopt these new technologies of communication. And they were very successful in indoctrinating an entire culture uh, with that new communications technology. And people really didn't have the intellectual tools developed yet because they didn't have the familiarity with that type of communication to know how to be skeptical of it, to recognize the pitfalls, to recognize when they're being manipulated. A similar thing happened with television in the 1950s and 60s, which led to the US countercultural revolution and the disregard for mainstream ideas and authority. And I would argue a similar thing is happening now with the internet and social media. And we just haven't developed the tools. It'll probably take another decade or more for us to really understand how to recognize when we're being manipulated in a broad sense across society. But the danger is that we may have a very rocky, violent time between now and then if history is any guide.
Yeah, how do we wind up somewhere more along the lines of the counterculture movement, which, definitely some rocky times, but also significantly better than what happened with the Nazis. Uh, how do,
Mhm.
how do we how do we move disinformation in the direction where we're looking more at a counterculture movement scenario than the Nazi scenario I fear we're staring down?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, we're definitely in a countercultural movement right now. Um, I think that, your question is to kind of think about it, you have to think about where folks were at in the 1960s with the counterculture. And there too, it was about distrust of authority and suspicion of the government. And a lot of those same actors actually are still involved in politics. They're just a lot older. You know, Trump's a boomer. He's from that time period, as are many of his advisors. And I think that they have been distrustful of government since they were in their teens. And this is just more of the same thing. So I don't know how we can, it's a really good question is how can we direct it more peacefully? Um, I don't know if that's where those folks are at. I think that there's a lot of anger in the movement, and it's about tearing things down, and it's about distrust and disregarding. And now they've got the power to do it, where they didn't have that in their teen years.
For sure. This is Steve Matteo with Trevor Christian here on WUSB, and our guest today is Shawn Otto. He's the author of The War on Science, Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It. And we're talking about climate denial and some of it in terms of the media. So where have we gone now through the years in terms of who are the institutions, who are the media people who on the one side are the ones that are continuing to put out this false information, continuing to deny not just climate change, but just science in general. And then I really do want to talk about who are the people that are trying to expose this, institutions or journalists, books, because I think it's important to not just talk about who the villains are here, but who are some of the people that our listeners can turn to try to get, information about who is doing this and why. And the other thing that I'm really interested in too is the sort of interconnectedness of these folks. Like I think sometimes we'll see people, let's pick some extreme right-wing people on social media, Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro, or whoever the case may be. Who funds these people? They don't just wake up one day and decide to do this and do it on their own in some cases, not all cases. So I know that's kind of a lot to sort of cover there, but I think it's interesting, and I think someone like you can bring a very sort of unique perspective to it.
Yeah, well, the old saying is follow the money. And when you do follow the money, you do find that what you're saying is exactly right, that there is a network of people, as Hillary Clinton once called it, a vast right-wing conspiracy. It turns out she was right, even though she was ridiculed for it at the time. And these people do have a lot of times, they have very similar funders that run through these astroturf organizations that are purportedly public policy think tanks, but in a lot of cases, they are really just kind of PR arms that are set up by fossil fuel interests or by wealthy investors in fossil fuel companies or in other commodity businesses that suffer when public health or environmental regulations are applied to them. And a lot of it is about rolling that back. You see that attitude throughout the Trump administration, is this heavy, heavy suspicion of all of science, anything to do with regulation, anything to do with the environment. And that disdain, it's not just a disregard, it's a really active, strong disdain, I think comes out of the suspicion that they have that left-wing politics has really infiltrated the environmental movement and the public health movement and academia. And they think that it's woke science or woke culture that it has corrupted public academic research. But that's really not the case, and that's not what's happening. There are issues with the meritocracy, but there's a lot of science that shows that when you have diverse groups of people, you actually produce better knowledge, and you're more able to uh, uh, reach successful outcomes. So the disregard or disdain winds up hurting America. Generally, our science enterprise has propelled, by some estimates, 70 to 75% of the American economic growth since the end of World War II. And Trump is talking about wanting to make America great again. You're not going to get there if you cut research into science and engineering that produces all of that gain. None of the things that we take for granted in our lives right now, from the internet to the Google search engine to MRI imaging to laser eye surgery or 3D printing or CRISPR gene editing technology, all of these things came out of the National Science Foundation basic science. Those weren't developed by companies. Those were developed on the public dime, and then private businesses were able to take that research and commercialize it. The Trump folks want to cut the NSF by 55%. What is that going to do to America's greatness in the world moving forward? What is that going to do to our ability to attract the best and brightest minds going forward, as we have since the days of the Nazis, when an intolerant authoritarian regime there propelled most of their science enterprise to move to the United States and England. The NIH is the world's biggest funder of biomedical research. It spends 83% of its budget on competitive grants, and another 11% of its budget supports its own scientists, about 6,000 scientists at its own laboratories. And that investment, you wonder, what does that buy us? We spend $48 billion a year at the National Institutes of Health. What do we get for it? Well, since the 1970s, our causes of death are from all causes. The U.S. death rate from all causes has declined by about 35%. And our lifespan has increased by, on average, about 10 years. We live 10 years longer thanks to that investment. Trump wants to cut the National Institutes of Health by 42%, or $20 billion roughly. So what's that going to do to people in their 30s and 40s now? Are they going to get the benefits of longer lifespan, or are they going to get a shorter lifespan? Is that really making America great again? National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, they do pretty much all the research that undergirds our the National Weather Service and what you see on TV that predicts the weather every night. That all comes from NOAA. And now the entire research division at NOAA that works on developing new ways of predicting the weather, managing ocean fisheries, and understanding climate change, that's been shut down. That's 100% cut to our research ability there. NASA, they don't only explore space, but they also have satellites that point at Earth so we can really understand the Earth systems. And again, because of their connection to climate change mostly, and Trump's disdain for that and suspicion of it, the entire research, the Earth science programs are suffering a 50% cut in Trump's budget. Department of Energy, you can keep going down the line. These public investments in science. DOE is responsible not only for our nuclear arsenal, but for researching energy supply and ways to improve it with nukes, with fossil fuels, with renewable energy. Equally, they invest in all of that to really understand it and come up with the most competitive energy infrastructure that the United States could have, and support that with research into basic physical sciences, energy sciences, nuclear physics, biological and environmental research, the new fusion energy sciences, high energy physics, they're being slated for a 35% cut. So this is really what's at stake right now. What has made America great, and if you're talking about making America great again, you're not going to get there by cutting research that has actually produced these gains.
Hmm. So where are we again to get back to how the information gets out there about climate change and science? Um, we've had a lot of changes now since Trump is back in office for the second time. We see a lot of sort of capitulation from media companies,
Hmm.
CBS, ABC. I think we know where the social media companies stand, particularly X, although that may be changing. Um, is the fact that these so many of these large media corporations, and I think the New York Times is always unique in because it's the New York Times, but because it is family owned. It's not part of this large corporation that owns 100 other different kinds of entities that don't have anything to do with journalism or news. Is the news media, particularly the mainstream corporate media, um, are they staying in the center on this issue, moving to the left, moving to the right? It seems to me that this can be another area where there might become or have already become skittish to cover climate change aggressively because it is the kind of thing that will make this president angry.
They have been, yeah, and we've seen that over and over again. And sometimes it's people with private interests, like Bezos and the Washington Post, that capitulate too. So private ownership isn't necessarily the answer if somebody feels vulnerable to Trump. And I think where a lot of the news media make a mistake, editors and news directors and publishers think of this in terms of left and right. But what's really happening in politics is it doesn't just have a left and right continuum. It also has a top-down continuum between authoritarian and anti-authoritarian. And where we've seen politics move is into more of an argument between the top and the bottom than the left and the right, between authoritarians and anti-authoritarians. And in that perspective, science is decidedly anti-authoritarian. It says, I don't take what you say on faith, show me the evidence, and I'll decide if what you say is true. And that's really where the news media should be, and where its role in democracy always was envisioned by the founders, who really valued a free and robust uh, news media environment. But they valued it in a context where people had the notion that there is an objective truth out there. The media has kind of made a mistake since World War II with the rise of this notion that there is no such thing as objectivity. And they think then that their job is to present both sides of an argument. And that's where they confuse left and right and top and down. As long as there are two sides of an argument, they want to be in the middle and present both sides and let the reader make their decision. But if one side is supported by facts and the other side isn't, you wind up slanting the argument, and that empowers extremist voices. And you provide a path into democracy for them. And once that happens, it's very hard to move them back out of the conversation. So the media has to realize that they do have a stake in this. They are on the side of democracy, which is the anti-authoritarian side of it. So exposing authoritarianism, looking at who the real actors are behind these initiatives, and taking steps to help the public really understand what's going on and the cynicism of what's going on is part of their responsibility. And if they don't do it, then they're letting us all down because that is our means of self-governance. And the only way that we can steer the ship of democracy successfully is with a news media as a rudder that believes that there really is an objective truth out there, as we know that there is in science. If there's a rainstorm and you and I each have a bucket outside our door, and we go out in the morning and we stick a ruler in it and it shows 1.5 inches, that's an objective measurement. So saying that there is no such thing as objectivity really steers us in the wrong direction.
Hmm. An interesting thing for us here on Long Island is the person who is now running the EPA, Lee Zeldin, is
Hmm.
our former congressional representative in the House of
Your
in the House.
former congressional representative.
Okay, fine. Okay, you're not in the same area. Okay,
He's not
and
taking any ownership of that.
Oh,
I don't know how much
I'd
you
like
know
to
about
have
him.
you.
I don't know how much you know about him, Shawn, but I wanted to just read you a few things here that I think would be really interesting. He received millions of dollars in exchange for consulting speeches and paid op-eds for the fossil fuel industry.
Oh, yeah.
His voting record is remarkably anti-environment and anti-climate, according to Food and Water Watch. As a member of Congress, he voted to slash the EPA budget by $2 billion, cheered Trump's efforts to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, opposed legislation that would restrict corporations' ability to discharge forever chemicals into waterways, and supported weakening EPA standards and the Clean Air Act around particulate matter pollution. Here's the real kicker, though. He did not report in his financial disclosures that he had been making money by writing paid commentaries in prominent news outlets without disclosing in those pieces that he had been paid to write them. Okay. Um, as a member of Congress, his rating was 14% out of 100%. Okay. Um, he voted he voted constantly, anti-environment. And where we live here on Long Island, the environment, it's a very sensitive issue. We're surrounded by water. It's we're in one of those places where, anything related to water, climate, we're overpopulated here on Long Island. Long Island should never have been this populated. So I'm curious how much you know about him, what your feeling is, and how do we get to a point where someone this wholly unqualified and doing things that are practically illegal. I mean, maybe we could debate it in a law, in a law situation, but and then he gets senators, and I think there were even some Democratic senators who voted to approve him. So I would love to get your feedback on this.
Yeah, well, this is Trump's MO, right? Is to take somebody who uh, hates an organization yeah, to their core and put them in charge of it because he wants to dismantle government and especially when it comes to do with anything to do with science, facts, climate change. This is what all authoritarians do. Anytime that there is an alternate authority that could challenge them, they want to dismantle and disempower that. And that's why Trump is really going after science. That's also why science has really been central to the whole American experiment. That's what the founders really relied on in a lot of ways to justify the United States at the beginning is the idea that there is objective truth that can be arrived at, not just the edicts of kings. So if you're an authoritarian and you want to tear something down, you find you find a guy that dislikes that thing and you put them in charge of it to disassemble it. And that's really what's been going on throughout the second Trump administration. It's kind of what he did in his first administration, but this time it's on steroids. And Zeldin he's one of the guys that when I was doing talks in the run up to the elections, I predicted if Trump would win, he'd probably put him in charge of of EPA. And that's why, because that's Trump's motivation. Um, Zeldin doesn't have any kind of background in science. He's got a bachelor's degree in political science. I guess you could say that's sort of science. I mean, it's called science, right? From SUNY. But he is not qualified in any way to make judgments about the EPA. What his main goal is deregulation, and that's what he's really argued for his entire career. So it's ironic, it's painful. It would be laughable if it wasn't so serious to put him in charge of an organization whose goal is regulation, right? But that goal is, again, you're talking about make America great. You want to make America great. You regulate it because you want to increase freedom. I don't want to die young because some guy is dumping chemicals into the St. Croix River near where I live, upstream from me, and it gives me cancer. That's impinging on my freedom. And when we have these regulations, if they're based on science, they're not based on somebody's ideas. They're based on evidence. And if we have them based on evidence and we promulgate a regulation based on that, the idea is to increase everybody's freedom because we know that this is going to cause cancer or this is going to damage the groundwater. This is going to add to climate change. This is going to increase asthma rates because it's going to increase air pollution in this area here. So these are all things that are evidence-based. They are all promulgated with the goal of increasing freedom. So these actions are reducing freedom. They're not making America great. They're making America weak.
Okay, well, and speaking of freedom, you're listening to WUSB FM. We're in Stony Brook, New York. I'm Steve Matteo. I'm here with Trevor Christian. Our guest is Shawn Otto. He is the author of The War on Science, Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It. And sometimes I almost think that this topic of the environment may be the most important. I know we can talk about war, we can talk about health, education. There's so many things, but I mean, if there's no more planet, if the planet just melts away, then all the other things are just, I mean, what are we discussing? Are we always
Right.
going to be in this situation where there's this constant fight because there's just simply so many people who are so well funded and there's so much money and power behind this sort of anti-science, anti-climate change thought. I mean, I don't want to sound, I don't want to be negative. I don't want to project into the future, but it does seem like the moneyed interests have an overwhelming advantage in terms of infrastructure, money, power, influence, that sort of thing. What can citizens do? And and maybe I'll ask a kind of a complimentary question. Where is Greenpeace while all this is happening? They used to be so much in the news and so much part of bringing the attention of this subject to people and doing things. And they seem to have become, to me, they've become invisible in the same way that I believe that Amnesty International has become this way in terms of what's going on in our country here in the United States.
Hmm.
I guess I should
No, you're
say,
right.
are they invisible through their own fault, or are they invisible through the news media no longer seeking out sources from the left?
It's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. But I think that you're right, Steve, that the largest driver behind much of this uh, is the environment and the debate over the environment and moneyed interests that were developed on old technology. And then new science comes along that says, wait a minute, this has some unintended consequences to public health or the environment. You got to regulate it. We got to scale back on some things. You got to put on these filters. And these interests perceive this as an existential threat. And in the case of climate change, it is an existential threat to their bottom line. And they are fighting tooth and nail uh, to win that battle. But it's a losing battle because it's also an existential threat to the climate ecosystem that we're in right now. And they're not going to win that ultimately. The question is, again, just as in the rest of this effort, is how long can you put off that day of reckoning? How long can you keep going? And in a democracy, it turns out you can keep going for quite a while. All you have to do is convince a small number of people that surround lawmakers, in this case, Republican lawmakers, and get them to vote against regulation. And you can keep going for decades, as it turns out. So that's kind of the Achilles heel that we've discovered of democracy, is this ability to hack it with a coordinated effort of it's called product defense. And product defense is essentially a marriage of public relations with legal and science. And you developed bogus science that supports your argument. You sue to slow people down, slow regulations down, or to quash scientists, or to harass scientists and hobble them with unending Freedom of Information Act requests, like they've tried to do with people like Mike Mann, and prominent climate scientists, to silence them. And then you put out disinformation through your PR channels based on that bogus science, based on those lawsuits that you filed, and you can put things off almost indefinitely, it seems.
Mm.
And that is what we're facing. But there's a certain thing called physics that you can't argue with. It doesn't care how much money that you have. In the physics of carbon dioxide and of methane in the atmosphere is that they are greenhouse gases, which is something that we've known for 175 years. And it's very basic physics. And unfortunately, it's working against all of us right now.
Mm.
Um, as far as facing the effects of climate change, public health funding, all those things sort of going out of control at the moment, those people who are funding the attacks on science, uh, given the amount of money they have, how much are they going to suffer from cuts to science versus how much are the rest of us going to suffer from those same cuts?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's classic, right? It's like the well-heeled evangelical who sends their daughter off for an abortion in Switzerland, right? Um, this is the same kind of thing. It's do as I say, not as I do. And when you have the money, you can work to protect it on the one hand by engaging in these kind of activities, but exempt yourself. And I think that there's a lot of that kind of hypocrisy going on.
Mm. What I'll try to do is, I know it's a little negative there. I'll try to flip the script and maybe come up with something a little positive here. So in Florida these days, and let's be clear here, Florida is very much a red state. It votes for Republicans, at least for president. It has a Republican governor. I believe it has two Republican senators, if I'm not mistaken. One of the things that's interesting that's happening there, and you, Shawn, I'm sure you know all about this, is homeowners insurance rates are skyrocketing because the insurance companies don't care about left or right or politics. They know that global warming is real, and they know that more and more homes are going underwater in that state. And so they're charging people through the nose. And I have a lot of people I know who live down there. So I guess on the one hand, this is it's not a good thing. It doesn't make me happy to see this, but I guess I'll say two things. Is one is the question of would this help people finally realize that, yeah, maybe this climate change thing is real because it will affect their pocketbook. And then the other question is, why isn't the environmental movement or lawmakers who are behind, taking care of the environment or various organizations not using this more as an example that's concrete, that's about dollars to make their point?
Yeah, well, definitely. And it's not just Florida, which, is, if the Greenland ice cap melts, Florida is going to be under 100 feet of seawater. But it's also California with wildfires. It's That's also driven by climate change, the drying out of the forests. Um, so this insurance issue, as I wrote about in the book, ultimately it translates directly into dollars and cents because it's all about tracking losses and pricing that risk of future loss in, and you just watch the trends, and the trends are something that doesn't know Democrat or Republican, authoritarian or anti-authoritarian. It just is what it is, and that's how it works, and that's the ultimate collective activity, if you will, is an insurance policy. Um, so there is that back pressure, but what I see happening in these cases is then we just wind up with the state taking it over with an assigned risk pool, like they do in, when companies can't get work comp insurance or something like that. You go through the assigned risk pool. So the taxpayer is taking on the burden again. And as soon as the taxpayer is taking on the burden, then you're subject to the whims of politics, and you wind up electing people who tell you, well, it's not going to be that bad. I can solve that problem for you. So I don't think we're out of the woods on that yet. I was more hopeful about 10 years ago when I began working on the war on science than I am now, just seeing how it has played out with taxpayers being put on the hook and then politicians winding up kind of muddying up the issue in the public dialogue, and the news media not really holding them to strong enough account for it.
Hmm.
But so sorry to take your positive and turn it into a negative
No,
there.
that's okay. That's fine. So for people who are listening to this and want to learn more and know more and they want to stay up on the subject, um, what can you recommend? And we kind of do this almost on every interview that we do, is, who are the journalists for us to follow, the media organizations, so podcasts, radio shows? What books should we be reading? Documentaries we should be checking out so we can be, can keep up to date, or we can flesh out more of our knowledge of the subject. And particularly if you can think of any that relate to the subject of media, like you did in that particular chapter, the rise of the anti-science news media. I mean, the rise is over. It's here. We're stuck with it. It's the gorilla in the room. So can you make any suggestions?
Yeah, well, the War on Science is a great starting point, just because my book, not to overly plug that, but it's got a ton of links and notes in it to all kinds of people that are working on the issue. That's one reason why it might be useful. But National Public Radio actually does a pretty good job, which is one reason why they're being targeted by the Trump administration. Specifically, the show On the Media is a terrific show that really does delve into a lot of these types of issues as well. Um, uh, in terms of podcasts, there are a ton of podcasts that I follow. I think in terms of mainstream podcasts, uh, Ezra Klein's always interesting. I think that his take on some of these issues is really helpful because he gets into some of the more complex nuances, even though I wouldn't say that he's really science focused, but when he gets into the interrelationships of these issues, he does a good job. Um, there is a whole ecosystem of podcasts out there that once you begin to explore science writers and science journalists in the podcasting sphere, you'll get exposed to uh, probably 50 really good shows, and I'm not going to plug one over the other because I think that they're all terrific.
I mean, I think we're all looking for not just answers, but maybe some hope. But we want to know what's going on. It's difficult. You want to know what's going on. You want to be informed, but the news cycle is 24/7 of just it's depression.
Hmm.
And we're not just talking
Yeah.
about climate change. We're talking about, I mean, as we sit here since Friday, LA is under siege right now, which we're not going to get into here and now, which is it's a flashpoint in this second administration. We won't get into it, but so just in general, what are you up to, and what's going on with you? Where are you headed?
Well, what I'm doing right now, I'm finishing up I'm finishing up a novel that actually explores all of these same issues, but does it uh, in a narrative format, in a fiction format that maybe gets some of the ideas across in a different way that maybe is going to be helpful. And that's called Battleground States. I'm working with my publisher right now on that. I'm looking at maybe another version of the War on Science coming out. Uh, I haven't really gotten heavily into that. I've just started to put together some notes for it. I travel a lot. I'm on the road talking about these issues, not only across the United States, but in other countries. Europe. I was just in Sri Lanka a few months ago. I'm going to go to Africa in another couple of months. Across the world, I think the level of is very high, and I don't think that we're at a dark tipping point. I think that we're at a bump in the road that has helped to let reasonable people know that there is a serious problem that they need to pay attention to. And that level of concern being high, that's what democracy thrives on. That's what democracy really needs in order to function well. So I am hopeful that this actually can produce this time period can produce some very good healthy reinvestment in civic society by people. And I see that a lot when I talk to young people at universities, where the level of concern there and the level of, frankly, of intelligence about the relationship between facts and science and democracy, and the knowledge of how people are being manipulated is pretty high. And that gives me a lot of hope too, that we're maybe moving past being confused by online social media and conspiracy theories, and to the point where we can recognize them, where young people can help lead us out of this.
Okay,
So
that's great.
I'm feeling good about the future overall. I don't think that anytime when you move forward in society, that's just the way democracies are. You get a backlash. And in this case, we have been moving forward pretty rapidly, and we're in a time of rapid change. So it's not surprising to me that we have a pretty strong backlash right now, but I don't see it going on forever.